This is the Innovations for Scenario Discovery session. Structure of the session is going to be 3 talks. We're going to target 15 minutes for each talk and a follow-up of approximately 5 minutes for question and answer. Feel free to raise your hand using the participants list, or you can also message questions as they occur to you during the talks. And I'll do my best to call on folks. I would request that you stay muted while the speakers are speaking and during the Q&A unless you are recognized to speak. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time on day 1. And this is the first of 2 sessions on the innovations of scenario discovery. And so with that, I would like to start off. Our first speaker is Bramke Jaffino from the TU Delft, and he'll be talking about exploring multi-actor inequality patterns using scenario discovery. And so with that, Bramke, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I am Bramke. I'm a PhD candidate at Delft University of Technology. And in this occasion, I will explain my work about exploring multi-actor inequality patterns using scenario discovery. So most of you in this room are probably familiar with scenario discovery, which is traditionally used for vulnerability analysis. So the idea of scenario discovery is we try to identify scenarios that lead to vulnerable results of our policy. So we first start with classifying our outcomes of interest into those that are vulnerable, which is exemplified by the red box here. And we use machine learning algorithms or algorithms basically to look for regions in the input space that lead to the vulnerable region in the output space. So we look for orthogonal boxes in the input space that can explain the high density of vulnerable scenarios. And this traditional application of scenario discovery rests on the assumptions of binary classification of the output space. But in some cases, we simply cannot have only 2 classes of the output space. We cannot simply have good or bad outcomes. In some cases, there might be multiple modes of vulnerability. An example is, for instance, if we explore inequality patterns. And what you see here are 2 examples of inequality patterns at the district level for rice farmers in the Vietnam Mekong Delta under 2 different scenarios. And as we do not put value judgment whether one inequality pattern is better than the other, we cannot simply say whether one of the outcome is better than the other, which means there might be multiple modes of vulnerability. And especially if we are doing deep uncertainty analysis, then we know that we could end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of different inequality patterns, which means that we first have to cluster these inequality patterns into just several distinct classes. But again, more than 2 classes like the traditional use of scenario discovery. To apprehend this problem, previous studies have used what is called multi-class scenario discovery. And the intuition here is we first do multidimensional clustering to our output space. So we end up with several clusters of output space. And then for each cluster of output space, we try to find the regions in the input space that can best explain this particular cluster. So we do scenario discovery iteratively to each cluster of the output space. This leads to my main research question, which is how can we use and adapt multi-class scenario discovery techniques to explore inequality patterns under deep uncertainty? I explore the use of 2 approaches here, which I labeled the cluster and classify and the multivariate regression trees approach. The first approach has been used in previous studies regarding multi-class scenario discovery. And here I propose an additional approach, which is the use of multivariate regression tree. But before explaining to the approach, I will briefly explain how we normally evaluate the performance of scenario discovery. In the traditional use of scenario discovery, we normally calculate what we call the separability of the input space. So we want to ensure that the identified regions in the input space are highly explanatory and are highly separable for our outcomes of interest, which in that case is for our vulnerable scenarios. But in multi-class scenario discovery, we know that we have multiple outcomes of interest, multiple vulnerable regions. And this leads to two additional criteria for scenario discovery, which are separability of output space and interpretability. In separability of output space, we want to make sure that, in this case, the inequality patterns within a cluster are similar, but the inequality patterns within different clusters are dissimilar. Whereas the interpretability simply refers to having a manageable number of clusters, because we do not want to present like 50 different inequality patterns to decision makers, because it is just too much. But we also don't want to have only like 3 inequality patterns, because that would be too simplified. A little bit of the context of my study. I'm doing research on adaptation planning for rice farmers in An Giang and Dong Thap in the upper Vietnam Mekong Delta, where I evaluate the profitability of the farmers at the district level. I generated 43,000 scenarios to combine 6 different pre-specified policies, as well as some uncertain factors related to upstream discharge, dam construction in Cambodia, as well as land use demand. I combine these policies and uncertain factors in an integrated model to calculate the average annual profit at the district level. And this average annual profit at the district level is what I use to evaluate the inequality among farmers in the different districts. Now let's go to the first approach. So we have our simulation results database, and then we need to pre-process them. We need to normalize them before we are going to do the clustering. And the first interesting thing here is to cluster the distributional patterns. So I follow a kind of a positive approach for this. I use the elbow method for selecting the appropriate number of clusters, because basically when doing clustering, how many number of clusters you want to have is your choice. And here I calculate the explained variance of the k-means algorithm for different number of clusters. And as you can expect, the higher number of clusters we have, then the higher the explained variance is, which means the better the model is. But then I also calculate, to select an appropriate number of cluster, I calculate the delta of explained variance, which is exemplified by the blue dots here. And I choose the number of clusters where the delta of explained variance is less than 0.05, which in this case corresponds to having 7 clusters. So we started with 43,000 inequality patterns, and then we clustered these inequality patterns into 7 different clusters. And then these are the representative inequality patterns from each of the cluster. We see some distinctive patterns here. For instance, in cluster 1, we see districts that are located along the diagonal line from northwest to southeast are the most profitable one. Whereas in cluster 3, for instance, we see that 3 districts in the middle north of the region who are becoming more profitable. And next, we want to identify what scenarios lead to each of the inequality pattern. And this is the core task of scenario discovery. I use the boosted trees algorithm for this. Boosted trees are basically classification algorithm using iterative classification or decision trees. And the way I use boosted trees is boosted trees allow us to calculate the feature importances or the relative importances of the different input features that we have in our model. The importance of the different uncertain factors as well as the policy variables. And we can rank them based on their importance in explaining the different clusters we have. We see here that the first most important factor is related to an uncertain variable, which is the upstream dam development in Cambodia, which is outside of the control of the Vietnam government, at least the local government. Whereas the next 3 important factors are related to policy levers of dikes policy. So whether we want to deconstruct dikes in An Giang into low dikes, or we want to expand high dikes in An Giang, or we want to expand high dikes in the Dong Thap province. And I use these 4 variables to develop narrative for each of the cluster of inequality pattern. So I map back the identified clusters into the input subspace. What you see here on the horizontal axis is the different degree of upstream dam development, 0 being no upstream dam is being developed, and 5 being around 130 upstream dams would be developed in the future. And on the vertical axis are the different policies related to dikes construction in the 2 provinces, which are An Giang and Dong Thap. And what you see here is that the way we interpret this is that inequality pattern from cluster 1 would emerge under the situation where upstream dam development is relatively high and high dikes are being constructed in Anjang or Dongtap or both, or if the current dikes construction is maintained. So we can, based on this graph, we can develop narratives under which inequality pattern like cluster 1 emerge. And we could do the same for all the 7 clusters and accordingly develop narratives under which the different inequality patterns emerge based on this graph. So this is the first approach. Now we go to the second approach. The first 2 steps are basically similar. We have to run the simulations, normalize the simulation results. But then in the second approach, I use multivariate regression tree directly to the simulation results. So I basically take the uncertain and policy variables as the input features to the MRT, whereas the profitability of the 23 districts as the target features of the MRT. And when doing MRT analysis, we have the same problem of selecting the tree depth or tree complexity. And in this case, I calculate the increase in the tenfold cross-validation score when we have a more complex or a tree with greater depth. And similar to the previous one, I calculate the delta in the cross-validation score, and I select the number of leaves or the tree complexity where the delta of the cross-validation score goes below 0.01, which in this case corresponds to having a tree with 18 leaves. This is the overview of the entire regression tree, which I will not go into detail in each of the leaf, but for illustration purpose, I will go just to the left branch of the tree. And this is the zoom in version of the left branch of the tree. So in decision tree, basically each node corresponds to one input variable, which in this case is either uncertain factor or a policy levers. And then if a scenario fulfills the condition, we go to the left branch of the tree. But if it doesn't, we go to the right branch of the tree. So one scenario could be a scenario where high dikes are being constructed in Anjang, and then the upstream dam development is relatively high. It is higher than 2.5, and high dikes are also being constructed in Dongtap. Then we would end up with inequality pattern as we see in cluster 4. We could follow the regression tree to each of the cluster and accordingly develop scenario narrative that lead to the different clusters of inequality patterns. And finally, I compare the 2 approaches with respect to the criteria I introduced earlier. For the first one, I approximate the separability of input space by observing the overlap of induced regions. So again, basically we want to have the input space as completely separable as possible. But when we use the first approach, we see that there are overlaps of identified input subspaces. For instance, what I show here, these 2 are the resulting narratives or resulting scenario discovery from the first approach from 2 different clusters, which are cluster 2 and cluster 7. And we see that the identified narratives are overlapping because the maintaining of the current dikes as well as the deconstruction of low dikes are a part of the narrative both from the cluster 2 and cluster 7. So we see that there are overlaps of identified input subspace. Whereas in the second approach, there is no overlaps of scenario narratives because each leaf from the resulting tree has its own unique combination of logic or its own unique narrative. For the second criterion, I calculate output separability indicators, which in this case, the average distance of scenarios within the same cluster and the average distance of scenarios between different clusters. So again, we want to have scenarios within the same cluster to be similar. So we want the distance within a cluster to be small, but we want to have the distance, or in this case, what I mean distance is the Euclidean distance between clusters to be dissimilar, to be high. Therefore, the first approach performs better in terms of between cluster distance, whereas the second approach performs better in terms of within cluster distance. And the last criterion is approximated by the number of scenarios, where we see here that the second approach leads to substantially higher number of scenarios. So to conclude, I have showcased the application of two different approaches for multi-class scenario discovery. And we see that the first approach performs slightly worse in terms of input and output space separability, but it has better interpretability because we only end up with 7 scenarios. Whereas in the second approach, we have slightly better output separability. And the second approach also has perfect separability of the input space because there is no overlap of scenarios membership. However, it comes at the expense of significantly worse interpretability. This is not to say that we always have to use one approach instead of the other. It really depends on the context of the study. If, for instance, the scenarios that are developed are to be used by other agencies in other contexts for other purposes, then the first approach might be better because it has better interpretability. But if the scenarios are to be used only for a single specific context for one planning purpose, and possibly in an iterative interactive sessions with decision makers, then we might prefer the second approach. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and I welcome questions.
Excellent, thank you. So with this, do we have folks with a question? So David Gold, you can unmute.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. First, really nice talk. Thanks, this is really interesting work. I guess I have a question about the separability criteria. So you're talking about how you have the potential for overlapping classification when you do classification versus regression never has overlapping. I guess my question is, is there a way that you can like validate that? How do you know that that's not just a figment of the regression? You know, how is there a way to look in and like make sure that there might not actually be overlapping criteria that aren't perfectly separable between different clusters?
Thank you for the questions. So basically, I would say that it is the nature of the decision tree that each final branch of the decision tree has its own unique combination of decision logic, which means that if you go to the different branch of the decision tree, you need to have a completely different logic. Let us take, for example, the difference between cluster 2 and cluster 3 here in this example, where you see that both clusters emerge if the high dikes in Anjang are constructed, if upstream dam development is relatively low, if low dikes in Dongtap are not constructed. But it differs when we look whether the high dikes in Dongtap are constructed or not. So I would say that this is really the nature of the decision tree, that each leaf has its own different logic. But what is tricky here when we want to compare input space separability with the first approach is that in the first approach, I select only here the first 4 input variables. And that is why we have some overlaps. It could be that, and this is what I plan to do, is if we take a larger number of variables when mapping back, when doing scenario discovery from the first approach, then we have smaller input space overlaps. But this is something that I hypothesize, but still, in the end, I would expect that there is a bit of overlap. We cannot, there will still be an overlap of input space when we follow the first approach, unless we really take all input factors into account. So in that sense, I would say that the conclusion that the second approach performs better in terms of input space separability is robust, whereas for output space separability, it might be that in other cases, the conclusion is different.
All right, thank you. Are there additional questions? Feel free to raise your hand. We have time for one more question. So I'll take the opportunity to ask one sort of brief question in terms of the metrics that you use in your clustering have a big effect, obviously, which relates back to your problem framing, right? And the ultimate measures that you use to define equity. Do you think there's a dimensional limit in the number of measures that you're using in your original definition of clustering where either of these would distinguish themselves? So more criteria in terms of what defines a cluster for equity?
If you want to observe whether, if you want to dig deeper in understanding whether our clustering works fine, I think what we could do is observe the variability of the scenarios within the same cluster. And in that sense, there might be a dimensionality problem where in my case, for instance, I have 23 districts, but if we calculate a higher number of outcomes, then it could be that the clustering algorithms actually fail to look for distinctive inequality patterns, I would say. So I agree with your point that there might be a dimensionality problem there, but to observe this deeper, then we have to do kind of sensitivity analysis or observe the same results observe the same approach for different case studies. But really, what I show so far is just the k-means. But what I did is was basically looking also at other clustering algorithms. And observing the change in the explained variance and select the clustering algorithm that leads to the highest explained variance in this case.
Excellent. So with that, why don't we transition to Flannery? Flannery Dolan at Tufts University will be sharing her work on understanding the multi-scale impacts of responses to water scarcity and land use change.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm a PhD candidate at Tufts University, and today I'll be talking about the economic impacts of water scarcity and of land scarcity induced by land use change. So land and water scarcity are incredibly complex issues because they depend upon multiple different systems that all rely on and feed back upon each other. So for instance, water supply largely governs agricultural output, and the high consumptive use of water in agricultural production may hamper a water scarce region's ability to produce energy from other water intensive sources. Then if this leads to a shift towards bioenergy, it might cause competition between food production and energy production for land resources. And then these multi-sectoral dynamics are further complicated by the fact that deeply uncertain factors strongly shape scarcity, such as population growth and climate change. Then the impacts of this scarcity depend upon the emergent behavior and adaptive capabilities of the economy. So in order to model the impacts of scarcity, we need an experimental framework that addresses all of this complexity. The main driving questions for this research are to find the economic impact of land and water scarcity in different future scenarios and in different regions, and to find the factors that lead a region to experience high magnitudes of economic impact. So to do this, we generate an ensemble of all the possible combinations of certain deeply uncertain factors, and then input these unique system states into an integrated assessment model that is capable of modeling the complex relationship between the Earth system and the economy. And then we can compute the economic impact from the resulting model simulations using gains and losses and economic surplus. The economic surplus is the area underneath the supply and demand curves along the price axis of a traditional quantity versus price plot of a market. And it gives us some distributional information about the preferences within a population because it tells us the value that consumers obtain from the price of a good being set lower than what they'd be willing to pay for it. And it tells us the value that producers obtain from the price of a good being set higher than what they'd be willing to sell it for. And then if there's some perturbation to the system, we can see the effects of that change through shifts in the supply and demand curves. And we can measure the direct impacts to the market in question and the indirect effects from feedbacks from tangential markets. Then the net effect of that perturbation leads to a new state of economic surplus. And if we calculate the difference between these two states of economic surplus, we can find the economic impact of that perturbation. So if we apply this calculation to a water market where our perturbation to the system is restricting the amount of supply that's available to a population of water, then we can calculate the economic impact of water scarcity. So this is our first application of this methodology. And in this study, we're varying multiple different scenario components, including different socioeconomic and agricultural yield trajectories that are based upon the 5 shared socioeconomic pathways. We're also varying 3 different levels of groundwater accessibility and a binary representation of reservoir storage capacity, 2 different land use tax regimes, and then 5 different Earth system models. We're holding a couple of factors constant, including RCP 4.5 forcing and using a carbon price that's consistent with the nationally determined contributions. So in total, this yields 3,000 experimental scenarios in which we're constraining the amount of water that's available to be used. And then for every experimental scenario, we generate a reference scenario where we're assuming an unlimited supply of water in order to find out how a population would respond if their water resources weren't restricted at all. Then we can calculate the economic surplus in every experimental scenario and subtract the economic surplus from the reference scenario that has an unlimited amount of water in order to find the economic impact of scarcity in that scenario. We might expect that there would be an inverse relationship between physical scarcity and the economic impact of scarcity, because we'd expect that higher amounts of physical scarcity would lead to higher negative impacts of scarcity, and then maybe lower amounts of physical scarcity would either lead to lower negative impacts or even positive impacts of scarcity. And here we're calculating physical scarcity by withdrawals over renewable supply. And we're performing a log transform on billions of dollars of economic impact. So here a value of -2 would correspond to a loss of $100 billion due to water scarcity in one time step in one basin. So plotting a water-rich basin first, this is the Orinoco Basin in South America. We can see that there's very little to no variation in physical water scarcity, but there is some variation between scenarios in the economic impact of scarcity here. And most of the scenarios have a slightly positive economic impact of scarcity. And that means that their demand is positive relative, there's a positive shift in demand relative to their reference scenario with an unlimited supply of water. And that's because since they have a relatively low equilibrium price of water, since they are a water-rich basin, they can produce water-intensive commodities at a lower price than other basins. And so when other basins are constrained with their water supply, they have a comparative advantage and can produce more water-intensive commodities to export to other basins and then obtain a positive benefit from scarcity. Then if we plot a more water-scarce basin, we can see a lot higher variability in physical water scarcity and the economic impact of scarcity as well. We can still see, however, that there are some scenarios that have positive impacts of scarcity, even though this is a water-scarce basin. It's important to note, though, that if these positive impacts fall above 1 on our physical water scarcity axis, that means that they're withdrawing more water than they have in renewable supply. And so they're obtaining these positive benefits unsustainably. Other water-scarce basins may have a different relationship between physical water scarcity and its economic impact, and that depends upon the unique characteristics of a basin and its adaptive nature to respond to water stress. Ultimately, however, we generally see a bimodal distribution in water-scarce basins where high physical water scarcity corresponds to higher impacts in both negative and positive scenarios. And to find out what factors cause these high magnitude impacts, we can use a factor mapping approach. But for this study, we're using the classification and regression trees algorithm, or CART. So this approach successively splits the input space to create the nodes with that are the most homogeneous. So in this case, we're using the regression approach of CART. So the splits correspond to maximizing the variance between groups and minimizing the variance within groups. If we're performing a CART analysis on the high magnitude negative scenarios first, we find that Earth system model forcing is the root node, where 3 of the Earth system models lead to these high negative impacts. This makes sense for this region of the world because the monsoonal dynamics in the Indian Ocean are modeled slightly differently in different Earth system models. So this leads to some hydrologic forcing uncertainty when looking at different models. We can see that the hydrologic forcing is actually amplified, though, as it propagates through the markets of the human system and then leads to a higher degree of uncertainty and economic impact. And we can see this amplification occur across the scenario ensemble in most scenarios and in most basins around the world. The next factor that leads to these high impact negative scenarios is the universal carbon tax. This tax prices the emissions of all the sectors of an economy, including the emissions from the land use sector. So since agricultural expansion is disincentivized, this prompts producers to then intensify their yields, which they do by relying on increased irrigation. Here we're plotting the universal carbon tax scenarios versus our other carbon tax where we don't price the emissions from the land use sector. So we can see that under the universal carbon tax, there's a much higher withdrawal of water, and it even shifts the ultimate price of water higher, because the producers are relying less on rain-fed irrigation and more on groundwater withdrawals to irrigate their crops. And finally, we find that SSP3 socioeconomics leads to this cluster of high impact negative scenarios. And this assumes, SSP3 assumes high population growth trajectories. So this makes sense because high population growth would increase the demand for food and therefore for water. Then if we perform a CART analysis on the positive impact scenarios, we see that the root node splits towards the other 2 Earth system models. And then the following 2 factors are then SSP3 assumptions as well. And like SSP3 socioeconomics, SSP3 agricultural assumptions also leads to high water demand because it assumes very low agricultural yields across the world. And so in these scenarios where there's more water available to the Sabarmati, it then increases its withdrawals relative to the reference scenario so that it can export more food to other basins that are in need. In essence here, in this basin though, we see that a supply side variable splits the positive and negative impacts, and then the high demand side assumptions lead to the high magnitudes of impact. And we might expect this behavior to hold for other hydrologic basins around the world too. But however, if we perform a CART analysis on all other hydrologic basins, we can see that there's actually a pretty even split between the supply side variables and the demand side variables being this first CART node. So this underscores the importance of using a scenario discovery approach when assessing the impact of water scarcity, because we wouldn't have been able to assume the importance of these factors a priori. So ultimately in this analysis, we find that scarcity is very context specific and it's strongly shaped by deeply uncertain scenario assumptions. And we find that basins might benefit from scarcity if they have a comparative advantage with respect to water resources and export their virtual water. But a lot of basins will do this unsustainably. And so this will lead to higher negative impacts in the long run. Our next application of this methodology is on the land sector, because we want to see if these same themes still hold. And land, like water, is another non-substitutable good. And there are many different factors that will induce land scarcity. We are using carbon pricing as a mechanism by which to induce scarcity and to serve as a proxy for these other factors, because carbon pricing will disincentivize agricultural expansion. So we have different carbon price scenarios here that will then correspond to different land scarcity scenarios. And we can apply these different land scarcity scenarios to different assumptions regarding carbon concentrations and temperature and water demands and nitrogen applications. And these assumptions will impact agricultural yields to different extents. And then if we calculate the economic surplus in each of these scarcity scenarios in every agricultural market, every crop market, and then subtract the corresponding scenario that does not have a carbon price policy associated with it, we can find the economic impact of land scarcity in that scenario. And we'd expect to see that the main drivers of impact will differ across regions, similar to what we found in our water study. We'd also expect to find trade-offs between the decreased production in land scarce scenarios and the decreased yields from climate change if there are little to no mitigation measures implemented. So thank you all for listening. I'd like to acknowledge the Multi-Sectoral Dynamics Program at the Department of Energy for funding this research. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, so the floor is open for questions. If you're not familiar, you go to your participants and you can raise hand there. So do we have any hands raised? Ned Gardner.
Hi,
Feel free to unmute.
yeah, so I'm wondering if the hydroclimatic uncertainty can be addressed through model selection. Are there, a priori understandings about representations of ocean atmosphere dynamics that make one model superior to another for the kinds of high and low precipitation scenarios you're concerned with?
We didn't go into understanding the dynamics of each specific or system model, but our main point here was that most of these models are heavily used by different research groups. And so there's some inherent trust in all of these models. And so we don't know what the outcome of the climate will be. So this is just a good representation of the hydroclimatic uncertainty that's very real. And we're showing that it has a very broad effect on the economic impacts of scarcity.
Ben Bryant, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if I understood correctly, you did all of your defining of scarcity and benchmarking of the importance of different drivers against a baseline of zero scarcity, which is not how the world exists. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what the rationale is for that choice versus some like base period baseline. And it seems off the top of my head like that would potentially change the drivers that you're talking about, and that analyzing drivers relative to the present or some estimation of the present would be more policy relevant. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we are projecting these use scenarios into the future. So if we were to use a counterfactual, we'd need some baseline that would then project into the future as well. And so that kind of, if we were to have such a baseline, that would kind of defeat the purpose of a scenario discovery approach, I think, because we'd be assuming that some future scenario is the most likely to occur. So in this case, we're just saying that, with constraints, this is how much that would impact an economy, because how scarcity is usually defined is some, you can't withdraw as much as you need to. So, so basically this is kind of like a metric of scarcity in a way, in which we're showing the impacts of having constraints in general.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes it. It seems like then you could still, it obviously is more work, but you could still go through the same exercise with different baselines that were of some policy interest, right? Like a no climate policy interest. Well, you still have a baseline of climate change or something like that.
Yes, that is a good idea. And maybe we could do that in the future. This was kind of a,
Always easy to add things.
yeah. Yeah, this was a kind of a pilot study to see if this metric, if we could glean interesting results from this approach, because it's not usually used in partial equilibrium models for the purpose of assessing water scarcity. And we do see really interesting dynamics that come out of using this. So,
yeah.
But that is a really good idea.
All right, sorry to have to close, but we're gonna have to stay on time. We'll have to transition now to our last speaker, Caroline Rosella.
Thank you, Patrick. So thank you everyone for coming to this presentation. I'm going to discuss how a DAP approach, coupled with a new integrate assessment model Basin Future, could help decision maker build their capability under irreducible uncertainty when planning in the long term. So the idea behind the purpose of this presentation is that how can we optimize the use of current integrate assessment models and improve the uptake of their result by decision maker for long-term planning. And the rationale for that approach is that when using forecasting approach, that is optimization approach in order to identify a solution that will maximize the benefit for the society from water resource, we may be limited in terms of internalization of externalities associated with long-term events and the uncertainty that is associated with those events. So we assume that using a robust and adaptive approach, which is described as a better tool in order to anticipate future challenges and deal with deep uncertainty, will help improving integrate assessment models' ability to manage deep uncertainty and to support decision maker capability to plan in the long term. So for the purpose of this design purpose, we went through, or we used the dynamic adaptive policy pathway approach. And the rationale for that choice is that to our knowledge, it's the only adaptive and robust approach that is kind of mimicking a modeling design process from the qualitative representation of a system with identifying critical features and their relationship to the formulation of the system into a quantitative model in order here to evaluate the robustness of different actions, the performance of adaptive pathways, and also the performance of a plan against different future scenarios. So for the purpose of this presentation, what we are looking at is how can we better or go through with our integrate assessment models, go through the first full step of this DAP approach and what information will be required for this model in order to go through that process. And as a case study, we decide to use a new tool, the Basin Future tool that I'm going to introduce right now before explaining our approach. So Basin Future is a new web-based platform developed by CSIRO that aim at evaluating surface water resource and that also enable users to be able to explore data-scarce river basin. The other interest of the tool is that it presents a user-friendly interface in order to ease the modeling process as well as the scenario design process for users. The other interest is that you can create models with different kind of resolution for a basin, as well as select among the variety of climate data sets, either historical or climate change one, in order to explore scenario over time. And the other interest is that it presents different features of socio-ecological system, as well as water resource management strategies. So the question is, how can we improve or make sure that we can go through the first full step of the DAP approach using Basin Future? What information is required? So the first step here, and I don't want you to really focus on all the detail of the system thinking diagram present here, but more on the process that we went through. So we took as a contextual case study, the Brahmani River Basin case in order to design this approach. And what we did as a first step is to represent a system thinking or conceptual representation of this basin from a stakeholder or modeler perspective and from the basin future tool perspective. And then we superimpose those two representations. And what you can see highlight in yellow is actually the information that is not provided by the basin future tool. So now the next question is, how can we represent that information in the tool? For that purpose, we can go to a kind of reflective pathway process. The first thing is to really evaluate the need for an information. If we need it, can it be directly extrapolated from the tool itself, either from making assumption about the parameters or indicators from the tool, or from just using the data provided by the tool to calculate a new indicator? If it cannot be extrapolated from the tool itself, will then it be possible to discuss these changes and their feasibility with the developers? And if yes, we can have a new parameter. So this thing is not stopping there, because next we need to think a little bit further and to think about what's happening when we cannot fully represent an information of interest for a system. What will be the consequence for the achievement of the plan? So we need to weigh that risk when we are in a situation where we have no solution or a partial representation of this solution. And then we need to manage that risk using contingency actions. So what you have here is some examples of the type of solutions that we set up in the case of the Brahmani River Basin in order for the Basin Future tool to go through the first 4 steps of the DAP approach. For example, we need to evaluate the impact of wastewater treatment of the system performance. And we can make the assumption that the domestic and industrial water return could be a proxy for that action. What we're going to assume is that the proportion of water that will be returned to surface water would only be the one that won't be consumed by domestic and industrial use and that will be treated. For now, identifying tipping points, we can ask the developers, instead of providing us with time series in monthly units, they can provide us with time series in daily units. And that will define a strategy to identify threshold for the actions and for the system, as well as expect time of occurrence when we are using a climate change scenario. Now, if evaluating adaptive pathways, we may need to implement for different systems of interest additional indicators for the system performance, like the human health in the case of the Brahmani River Basin. And then what we can do is that we can calculate a new indicator for human health, the green-blue water scarcity indicator, from the data that are provided by the tool. So to conclude, what are the implications for adapting a DAP approach to integrate assessment models? The first thing to keep in mind is that in all cases, whatever the sophistication of the model, there will always be limitations in terms of representation of reality. But with comparing conceptual representation of a basin from a stakeholder perspective and from the model perspective, you can identify these mismatches. And the next step is to try to imagine what would be the solutions to better represent this information. The solution needs to be targeted to water resource, because water resource is the cohesive element between all the building models within the tool. Now, in situations where you have a partial representation of this information, you need to weigh the risk for the plan achievement and to manage that risk using contingency actions. And lastly, if changes need to be made in the tool and need to be discussed with the developers, a knowledge broker or a modeler could either intervene as somebody that will find solutions and discuss solutions with the developers, or serve as a communication mediator between end user and developers. Thank you for your attention.
All right, well, that provides some more time potentially for discussion. So while we give folks a chance, I'll ask a question. So in the process of sort of thinking through this and the model development phase, I'm wondering in terms of how much you all are thinking through the metrics of focus, so the decision relevant metrics that the systems will want to concern. And not all of those are strictly water balance, or they may be coupled to water balance. And so I guess for scoping the candidate evaluations, is that something you've thought through, where there are multiple diverse measures that the model may or may not be capable of?
I'm not 100%
Cost,
sure.
equity, financial variability,
Yes.
capital
So we are
intensity.
yeah. So we are really at the start of designing this approach. So far, we are looking at these main indicators, but also we're thinking towards also these directions, because that will be also step to inform decision makers and policymakers to have a visual ideas of what would be the impact or the interest of different pathways and sequence of actions that we can figure out over time. The other thing, what we think when you're talking about social equity, and that's the interest also of the DAP approach, is that this approach aim at not trying to find optimized solutions. It's just like also, it's a support for reflection. It's there to help you understand what could happen in the future and the different societal and biophysical factors that we need also to consider. And also like the future generation needs and all that equity factors around that.
So one of our audience, so Doug Samuelson, has asked, what do you consider to be within scope of DAP, so the Dynamic Adaptive Policy Pathways approach? And he states he's not sure what the term DAP approach is, how it's defined here in terms of what's within scope of DAP itself. So I guess in some sense, clarification of the framework and then your view of what is or is not sort of DAP from your view.
So my view is the framework is used in order to try to tackle deep uncertainty here. So it's a kind of support or template in which we are that we're using for a reflective approach. Now, DAP is interesting because it just helps us consider or multiple like potential solutions and a portfolio of action in the future. So not sure, maybe I'm not answering the question and I apologize for that, but not sure to understand where you're going.
Yeah, that's okay. And I think in terms of my view of dynamic adaptive policy pathways, it's a sequencing and prioritization of optionality in large capital investments typically is the way that it's shown. So large pathways of actions that are prioritized and sequenced in time. And also you can see it as a learning and feedback framework. Joseph, do you want to unmute?
I basically said what I wanted in the chat, but it's just to emphasize that what we're looking here is precisely the case where we've got an existing entry-level model tool that's meant to be widely used, and looking at how that can be applied with that. And so because it's meant to be a tool that can be applied anywhere, it's always going to have this major limitations, and it's going to have a lot of issues in terms of not being able to address issues that need large amounts of data. And so cost benefit data is an example of that. So it really puts the emphasis on, well, what do you do? What are the minimal information requirements you need in this context?
And then Doug, did you want to unmute and ask your question? Doug Samuelson?
Yes, thank you. What I'm getting at is clearly this was a situation where you started with a model, a context, quite a bit of definition of what the problem space was and what the possibilities were. But DAP, as you indicate, seems to have broader applicability, which then raises the question, how do I know to which situations and which problems it is properly applicable? You must have to make some assumptions about the nature of the problem, the availability of data, how much you can know about the, at least at the beginning, unforeseen possibilities. So how do you know when you have an appropriate situation to apply this approach?
And I'm going to recommend we call on one of the original authors of the paper. Jan, do you want to jump in and sort of take your perspective on that?
Just a couple of thoughts on this. First, I'm always a little bit hesitant to suggest that a given approach is applicable to a certain type of problem. And that's because of a very fundamental reason. An approach is likely also a way of looking at the world. So often when you take an approach like DAP, but this applies equally well to modeling approaches, to a problem, you start framing the problem in light of that approach that you bring to the problem. That being said, I think the way Pat characterizes DAP, basically it's about sequencing, prioritization of actions. That is the primary thing it tries to do. So if you don't have a large portfolio of options, where you have to be a little bit careful in how you sequence them, because there might be complex interdependencies between them with inclusion and exclusion relations, then applying DAP makes little sense, for example.
Excellent. Do we have any final questions, comments for the session as we close out?
So beware of framing bias. Yeah, okay, good.
That
Good,
that
right?
actually is fundamental. I think there is no such thing as a neutral framing. Was there another comment? All right, so with that, Zoom-based applause for our speakers. Thank you very much. And with that, I believe that concludes our session in day one. There is another session that'll be chaired by Jan tomorrow on scenario discovery innovation. So thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope you all have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you very much. And thank you to the speakers.